It is Christmas Eve, 1971. You are 17 years old. You are sitting beside your mother on an airplane somewhere over the Amazon rainforest in Peru. Outside the window, the sky has turned black. Lightning is flickering through enormous storm clouds. The plane is shaking. And then, without warning, everything comes apart. Not a controlled emergency landing. Not a gradual descent. The airplane, all of it, the fuselage, the wings, the seats, the people, simply breaks into pieces in midair. And you, still strapped to your seat, are falling. 3,000 meters. Nearly 10,000 feet. The jungle canopy is a dark green blur far below. The wind is screaming. Other seats are falling around you. Other passengers, luggage, pieces of the aircraft. And then the canopy rushes up to meet you, and everything goes dark. When you wake up, you are lying in the Amazon jungle. You are alone. You have a broken collarbone, a deep gash on your arm, one eye swollen completely shut, and a concussion. Your mother, who was sitting right next to you, is gone. There are 91 other people on that flight. You are the only one who survived the fall. And now you have to survive the jungle. What happened to Juliane Koepcke on December 24, 1971, is one of the most statistically improbable survival events in recorded history. The fall alone should have killed her. The jungle alone should have killed her. The combination of the two, for a 17-year-old girl alone in one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth, should have been unsurvivable by any reasonable calculation. But Juliane Koepcke was not an ordinary 17-year-old, and the jungle, it turned out, was not entirely a stranger to her. This is her full story. To understand how Juliane Koepcke survived what she survived, you have to understand who she was before the plane went down. Because the story of her survival begins not in the jungle in 1971, but years earlier, in a research station deep in the Amazon, where a young girl was learning, without knowing it, exactly what she would one day need to know. Juliane was born on October 10, 1954, in Lima, Peru, to two German scientists who had chosen one of the most extraordinary lives imaginable. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, was a renowned ornithologist and biologist. Her mother, Maria Koepcke, was an equally distinguished zoologist and ornithologist, a scientist of exceptional ability who would go on to have a species of bird named after her. Together, they had moved from Germany to Peru to pursue their research, drawn by the staggering biological richness of the Amazon basin. In 1968, when Juliane was 13, her parents established the Panguana Biological Research Station, a field station deep in the Peruvian Amazon, in the Pichitea River basin. It was not a comfortable outpost. It was a working research station in genuine wilderness, accessible only by small plane or long river journey, surrounded by primary rainforest. And Juliane grew up there for long stretches of her childhood. This is the detail that changes everything about her story. While other German teenagers were going to school in Lima, watching television, and navigating the ordinary social anxieties of adolescence, Juliane was spending months at a time in the Amazon. She learned, from her scientist parents, how to move through the jungle. She learned which plants were edible and which were dangerous. She learned that rivers, in the Amazon, are roads that following water downstream leads, eventually, to human habitation. She learned to identify insects, birds, and animals. She learned the rhythms of the rainforest, when to move, when to be still, what sounds meant danger, and what sounds were simply the ordinary noise of an ecosystem going about its business. She did not learn these things as survival training. She learned them the way children learn things when they grow up around passionate, knowledgeable adults, by absorption, by participation, by the slow accumulation of experience in a place that became, over time, as familiar as home. By the time she was 17, Juliane Koepcke was not a typical Lima teenager with a vague familiarity with nature. She was a young scientist's daughter who had spent significant portions of her life in the Amazon, who understood the jungle not as a hostile alien environment, but as a complex, readable world with its own logic and its own rules. That knowledge would save her life. But first, December 24th, 1971. Juliane and her mother Maria were in Lima for Juliane's high school graduation ceremony. It had been a significant milestone, and now, after the celebrations, they were flying back to join Hans Wilhelm at the Panguana Research Station for Christmas. They had tickets on Lanza Flight 508, a Lockheed Electra turboprop operated by Líneas Aéreas Nacionales S.A., departing Lima for Pucallpa. Lanza had a troubled safety record. The airline had already been involved in 2 fatal crashes before this flight. There were warnings. There was a reason that many experienced travelers in Peru avoided Lanza when they could. But it was Christmas Eve, other flights were full, and they had a research station waiting. They boarded the plane. Lanza Flight 508 carried 92 people, 86 passengers, and 6 crew. It departed Jorge Chávez International Airport in Lima at noon on December 24th, 1971. The flight to Pucallpa normally takes about an hour. The route crosses the Andes and then descends into the vast lowland Amazon basin, a transition from the dramatic mountain landscape of coastal Peru into the flat, endless green of the jungle below. The weather that day was severe. The Amazon basin in December is deep in its wet season. Massive convective thunderstorms build rapidly over the jungle, reaching extraordinary heights and generating lightning, turbulence, and downdrafts capable of tearing an aircraft apart. Experienced pilots know to route around these storms. The decision made by the crew of Flight 508 to fly directly into the storm system rather than divert was, in retrospect, fatal. Juliane later recalled that as the plane entered the clouds, turbulence became violent almost immediately. Passengers around her were frightened. Her mother, Maria, reached over and took her hand. Then lightning struck the right fuel tank. The explosion tore the right wing off. The aircraft began to break apart. In the chaos, which Juliane later described as happening with terrifying speed, the fuselage split open. Passengers, seats, luggage, and pieces of the aircraft were sucked out into the storm. Juliane found herself outside the plane. She was still strapped to her seat, a row of 3 seats, to which she was attached at the middle position. The seat assembly, with her in it, was tumbling through the air at altitude, in the middle of a thunderstorm, over the Amazon jungle. She was falling from approximately 3,000 meters, roughly 10,000 feet. What happened next is something that aeronautical and medical experts have studied in the decades since, trying to understand how she survived. The answer involves a combination of factors, each necessary, none sufficient alone. The seat assembly, 3 seats joined together, created a wing-like structure as it fell, generating rotational drag. Like a sycamore seed spinning as it falls from a tree, the rotating seat slowed the descent below what it would have been for a person falling freely. It was not a parachute. It was not controlled. But it was something. The jungle canopy beneath her was extraordinarily dense primary rainforest, the kind of interlocked, multi-layered canopy that forms a near-continuous surface over the forest floor. The canopy absorbed and distributed the kinetic energy of impact in a way that open ground never could have. She did not hit solid earth. She hit a series of progressively more resistant surfaces: leaves, branches, smaller branches, larger branches, each one slowing her slightly before the next. She lost consciousness on impact. When she woke up, she was on the jungle floor, still strapped to her seat. She did not know how long she had been unconscious. It was the following morning, Christmas Day, 1971. She was alive. She had a broken collarbone, a deep gash on her right arm. Her right eye was swollen almost completely shut from an impact injury. She had lost one of her shoes. She was almost certainly concussed. Around her, the jungle was silent in the way the Amazon is never truly silent, full of bird calls, insect noise, the dripping of moisture from the canopy above. There was no one else. She called for her mother. No answer. She called again. The jungle absorbed her voice and gave nothing back. She was alone. Juliane Koepcke was 17 years old, injured, alone, and at the bottom of a jungle somewhere in the Peruvian Amazon. She had no map, no compass, no food, no water, and no way to communicate with the outside world. What she had was everything her parents had taught her. The first thing she did, once she was able to move, was search the immediate area for other survivors, for her mother, for anything useful. She found debris from the plane, Christmas presents, still wrapped, scattered across the jungle floor. She found rows of seats with passengers still strapped in them, all dead. She found no one alive. She found one thing that was useful, a bag of hard candy. She took it. It would be almost the only food she had for 11 days. The decision she made next was the one that saved her life. She remembered what her father had told her years earlier at Panguana. In the Amazon, if you are lost, find water and follow it downstream. Small streams lead to larger streams. Larger streams lead to rivers. Rivers lead to people. In the Amazon basin, where roads are few and rivers are highways, this is not just good advice. It is the fundamental logic of navigation. She found a small stream and began to follow it. Moving through primary Amazon rainforest is not like walking through a park. The undergrowth is dense, the ground is uneven, roots and fallen logs create constant obstacles, and the humidity is so extreme that simply existing in it is physically exhausting. Juliane was doing this with a broken collarbone, one functional eye, and no proper footwear on one foot. She moved slowly. She moved carefully, and she kept following the water. The jungle around her was alive in every direction. The Amazon rainforest contains the highest density of species of any ecosystem on Earth, more species of birds, insects, mammals, and reptiles per square kilometer than anywhere else. This extraordinary abundance is also, in its way, a set of dangers. Venomous snakes, caimans in the water, insects that carry disease, plants that cut and irritate and poison. Juliane knew this, and crucially, she knew how to read it. She knew not to wade through water she couldn't see the bottom of, where caimans and electric eels might be waiting. She knew to watch where she stepped. She knew that the rustling in the undergrowth was almost always something that was more afraid of her than she needed to be afraid of it. She knew that the Amazon, for all its dangers, was not actively hunting her. It was indifferent to her, which was something she could work with. She slept on the ground, in the jungle, every night. She had no shelter and no fire. She was, in the most fundamental sense, an animal in an environment that contained larger, better adapted animals. But she was a thinking animal, and she used it. The injury to her arm was concerning from the beginning. The gash was deep, and in the Amazon, open wounds are an open invitation. On the third or fourth day, Juliane noticed something that is almost unbearable to imagine. The wound was moving. Maggots, the larvae of blowflies, had found the wound and laid eggs. She could see them under the skin and feel them. She remembered something her father had taught her. In the jungle, there is a method for removing fly larvae from a wound. You introduce a liquid that causes them to move toward the surface. In the absence of proper medical supplies, local knowledge suggests gasoline or kerosene. She had neither. She kept the wound as clean as she could and kept moving. By the time she was found, there were dozens of larvae in the wound. The eventual treatment required a medical team, but they had not killed her. The days passed in a rhythm of movement and rest. Follow the stream. Stop when the light fades. Sleep. Move again at dawn. The hard candy ran out within the first few days. She was sustained after that by the water of the stream and by the extraordinary stubbornness of a young woman who had decided, somewhere in those first hours, that she was going to get out. She saw no other survivors. She occasionally found more wreckage from the plane, pieces of fuselage, personal belongings, bodies. These encounters were deeply traumatic. She searched each site for any sign of her mother and found none. On the fourth day, she found something that lifted her spirits briefly and then devastated her. She found 3 passengers still strapped to a row of seats, like her own, which had apparently fallen from the plane. They were dead, but one of them was wearing a watch, and it was still running. It told her the date and time, which gave her, at least, a reference point. She was not as lost in time as she had felt. She kept moving. The stream grew. It joined a larger waterway. This was exactly what her father had described, the system of the Amazon, the way water finds its way down and out. She was going in the right direction. On the 9th day, she found a small boat pulled up on the bank of the river. Near it was a simple shelter, a lean-to with a roof of palm leaves. Inside the shelter were supplies, a container of gasoline, a motor for a boat, and most critically, some food. She used the gasoline, as best she could, to treat the wound on her arm, pouring it over the site where the larvae were embedded, enduring the pain, removing as many as she could reach. She waited at the shelter, knowing that boats have owners and owners come back. She was right. On the 11th day, January 3rd, 1972, 3 local men arrived at the shelter. Lumber workers, using the river for their trade. They found a 17-year-old girl, alone, injured, half-starved, and calm enough to explain, in Spanish, what had happened to her. They treated her wound as best they could. They gave her food, and the following day, they took her by boat to the nearest settlement with a radio. Contact was made with the outside world. Juliane Koepcke had been in the Amazon jungle, alone, for 11 days. She was alive. The news of her survival was received with a disbelief that is entirely understandable. 92 people had been on Lanza Flight 508. Rescue teams, dispatched after the crash was reported, had been searching the jungle for survivors and wreckage. They had found wreckage. They had found bodies. They had found no survivors, because there were none beyond Juliane, and she had been moving through the jungle away from the crash site. When she emerged, her survival was immediately international news. A 17-year-old girl, the only survivor of a catastrophic air disaster, who had fallen nearly 3 kilometers and then walked out of the Amazon. The story was almost too extraordinary to process. Her father, Hans Wilhelm, reached her within days. The reunion, by all accounts, was overwhelming in the way that reunions are when both people had genuinely believed the other might be dead. Her mother, Maria, was not there. Maria Koepcke's body was eventually found by rescue teams in the jungle. She had survived the fall. Investigators believe she was alive when she hit the ground, but was fatally injured and died over the following hours or days. She was found a short distance from where Juliane had regained consciousness. This is the part of the story that resists the clean shape of a survival narrative. Juliane survived. Her mother, who was sitting beside her, did not. They fell together. They landed, apparently, not far from each other. And the difference between life and death, in those terrible hours after the crash, was a distance that Juliane, injured, concussed, calling into the jungle, could not close. The grief of that is something Juliane has carried for the rest of her life. She has spoken about it with honesty, the survivor's guilt that is not simple or straightforward, but that takes the specific and agonizing form of knowing that your mother was somewhere nearby and you did not find her in time. Maria Koepcke had been not just a parent but a scientist, a colleague, an intellectual companion, and the person who had sat beside her on that plane with her hand in hers as the storm took everything apart. Her loss was not just personal grief. It was the loss of the woman who, alongside Hans Wilhelm, had made Juliane who she was. The physical recovery took time. The wound on her arm required extensive medical treatment. The removal of larvae, wound cleaning, antibiotics, monitoring for infection. Her collarbone healed. Her eye recovered. She was, physically, remarkably intact given what she had been through. The psychological recovery was less linear. Juliane has never pretended otherwise. The trauma of the crash, the 11 days in the jungle, the finding of bodies, the loss of her mother. These were not things that resolved quickly or neatly. She lived with them and found ways to carry them. What is striking, in the years and decades following the crash, is what she did with her survival. Juliane Koepcke became a scientist. This should perhaps not be surprising. She was the daughter of two exceptional scientists, raised partly in a research station in the Amazon. But the specific path she chose, and where it led her, is remarkable. She returned to Germany to complete her education. She studied biology, following the path her parents had modeled for her. She pursued a doctorate. She built a career as a research scientist, specializing, as her parents had, in mammalogy and the ecosystems of the Amazon basin. And she returned to Panguana. The research station that her parents had established in 1968 in the Peruvian Amazon became her life's work. The jungle that had nearly killed her, where she had spent 11 days alone, injured and afraid, was also the place she knew most deeply, the place where her parents had done their most important work, the place that was, in some fundamental way, home. She did not return out of compulsion or unresolved trauma. She returned because she loved it and because the scientific work being done there mattered to her. In the decades following the crash, she worked to establish Panguana as a protected area, to ensure that the extraordinary biodiversity of that section of the Amazon would be preserved against the deforestation and development pressures that were consuming so much of the basin. She succeeded. In 2011, Panguana was officially designated a private conservation area, the first of its kind in Peru. It encompasses over 1,000 hectares of primary rainforest, protecting an ecosystem of extraordinary richness. It is her parents' legacy, and it is hers. She wrote a memoir, published in German in 2011 as Wenn ich einen Vogel wäre, When I Fell from the Sky in English translation. The book is remarkable for its clarity and its lack of melodrama. Juliane writes about the crash, the 11 days, the grief, and the return to Panguana with the precision of a scientist and the emotional honesty of someone who has spent decades making sense of an experience that defies easy sense-making. The book became an international success. It introduced her story to a new generation of readers who had not been alive in 1971 or who knew only the outlines of the famous survival case without its human depth. She also encountered Werner Herzog. Herzog, the legendary German filmmaker, had an extraordinary connection to Lanza Flight 508. He had been in Peru in 1971, filming Aguirre, The Wrath of God, and had at one point held tickets on a Lanza flight in the same period as the crash. Scheduling changes meant he never boarded. The plane that crashed may have been one he was nearly on. Herzog tracked Juliane down in the 1990s and asked to make a documentary about her return to the crash site. Wings of Hope, released in 1998, follows Juliane as she goes back to the jungle, back to the area where she fell, where she walked out, where her mother was found. The film is quiet and serious, as Herzog at his best always is, and it captures something that is hard to put into words: the strange relationship between a person and the place that nearly killed them, when that place is also a place they love. Juliane collaborated fully with the film. She stands in the jungle and tells her story with a composure that is not coldness. It is something harder to achieve than coldness. It is the composure of someone who has genuinely processed something and carries it without being crushed by it. She married. She has lived between Germany and Peru. She has continued her scientific work at Panguana, publishing research, training young scientists, and advocating for the conservation of the Amazon. She built, in other words, a full and serious life, rooted in the Amazon that her parents had loved and that she had inherited both their love for and their knowledge of. People have been trying to answer this question since 1972, and the answer is not a single thing. It is a combination of factors, each one necessary, that aligned in a way that was extraordinarily improbable. The first factor is physics. The seat assembly she was strapped to created rotational drag during the fall, slowing her descent. The dense Amazon canopy absorbed and distributed the impact energy. Neither of these things alone would have been sufficient. A slowed fall onto hard ground would still have been fatal. A full-speed fall into canopy might also have been unsurvivable. The combination, in this specific configuration, at this specific location, was what made the fall survivable. This is largely luck. She had no control over where the seat assembly fell, how it rotated, or what was beneath it. She was fortunate, extraordinarily, improbably fortunate. The second factor is knowledge. And here, luck gives way to something she and her parents earned. The knowledge of the Amazon that Juliane carried into that jungle. Follow the water downstream. Watch for caiman in still water. Open wounds need treatment. The jungle is navigable if you understand its logic, was not instinctive. It was taught and learned over years of living in that environment. Without that knowledge, the survival of the fall would have meant nothing. She would have been alive at the bottom of the jungle with no idea how to get out. The Amazon is not kind to those who do not understand it. The third factor is psychology. This is perhaps the hardest to quantify, but in some ways the most important. Juliane Koepcke, at 17, in pain, alone, grieving, and in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, did not panic. She did not freeze. She did not collapse into despair, though she had every reason to. She made decisions. Rational, sequential, survival-oriented decisions. Find water. Follow it. Move during light. Rest in dark. Conserve energy. Keep going. Where does that come from in a 17-year-old? Some of it is temperament. Some of it is the practical, empirical worldview of someone raised by scientists. The habit of observing, assessing, and responding rather than reacting emotionally. Some of it is simply the irreducible mystery of who Juliane Koepcke is. She has said, in interviews, that she did not feel heroic at the time. She felt frightened and sad and exhausted. She thought about her mother constantly. She was not certain she would make it out. But she kept going because stopping was the only thing she was certain would end badly. That is not heroism in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter and more durable, the simple, stubborn refusal to stop while there is still a direction to go. The fourth factor, and this one is worth naming explicitly, is her upbringing. Not just the knowledge of the jungle, but the broader formation of who she was. Parents who took her seriously as a young person. An education that was unconventional and challenging and real. A childhood that had asked things of her, physically and intellectually. She arrived at that jungle floor as someone who had been prepared, without knowing it, for exactly this. There is something in that worth sitting with. We do not know, when we teach children things, which things will matter most. Hans Wilhelm and Maria Koepcke were not teaching their daughter jungle survival skills because they anticipated a plane crash. They were simply scientists who loved the Amazon and brought their daughter into that world with them. The survival knowledge was a byproduct of a life genuinely lived. And it saved her. Juliane Koepcke's story is often told as a pure survival story. The physics of the fall, the 11 days in the jungle, the emergence from the trees. And that story is worth telling on its own terms. It is one of the most remarkable physical survival events in documented history. But the deeper story is about something else. It is about the relationship between a person and a place. The Amazon that nearly killed Juliane is the same Amazon she returned to, worked in, loved, and devoted her scientific life to protecting. She did not flee from it. She did not define herself as its victim. She went back, again and again, and made it the center of her life's work. There is something almost philosophical about this. The place of greatest trauma became the place of greatest purpose. The jungle that took her mother and nearly took her is also the jungle that her parents loved, that shaped her, and that she has worked for decades to preserve. This is not a simple psychological resolution. It is not a neat story of healing. It is something more complex and more human. The capacity to hold grief and love for the same place simultaneously, and to let that combination, rather than either feeling alone, drive what you do with your life. Her story is also about inheritance, the things our parents give us that we do not fully understand until we need them. Juliane received from her parents not just knowledge and skills, but a way of seeing the world, a scientific, observational, empirical way of engaging with reality that served her, in those 11 days, better than any amount of courage or physical strength alone could have. We do not always know what we are giving our children. We do not always know what they are absorbing from the lives we live around them. Juliane's story is, among other things, a reminder that the most important things we pass on are not the things we intend to teach. And finally, her story is about what survival actually means. Not the survival of the fall, not the 11 days, but the decades after, the choice to return to the jungle, to build a scientific life there, to protect the ecosystem that is also her parents' memorial, to write honestly about what she experienced, to let the worst thing that ever happened to her become part of a larger, purposeful, continuing life. That is the harder survival, and she has done it with a quietness and a seriousness that is, in its own way, as extraordinary as anything that happened in December 1971. Juliane Koepcke is alive today. She is in her late 60s. She continues her conservation work at Panguana, in the Peruvian Amazon, where her parents' research station still stands and where the primary rainforest they work to understand and protect still grows. The Amazon has changed in the decades since 1971, much of it lost to deforestation, development, and the grinding pressure of human expansion. The work of conservation has become harder and more urgent. Panguana, as a protected area, is a small island of continuity in a landscape that is under enormous threat. She keeps working. The crash site of Lanza Flight 508 is still somewhere in that jungle. The Amazon, left to itself, reclaims everything. Metal rusts and is swallowed by roots. Fabric rots. The specific geometry of destruction that scattered 92 people across the forest floor in December 1971 has been, over 50 years, absorbed back into the endless green. But Juliane was there, and she walked out. She walked out because of physics, the improbable luck of a rotating seat and a dense canopy. She walked out because of knowledge, years of living in the Amazon with parents who understood it and shared that understanding with her. She walked out because of something in herself that kept her moving when moving was the last thing her body wanted to do. And she walked back in, not once, but many times for the rest of her life. Back to the place where her mother died and where she survived. Back to the research and the forest and the work. Werner Herzog, who almost shared her fate on a Lanza flight, said of her story that it was not simply a survival story. It was a story about a person and a place that were, in some profound and unresolvable way, made for each other. I think that is right. The jungle did not kill Juliane Koepcke, and Juliane Koepcke did not conquer the jungle. They found, somehow, a way to coexist. The girl who fell from the sky and the forest that caught her. And in the decades since, she has repaid that debt in the only currency that makes sense, a life spent trying to understand it and to keep it alive. Tamam should means it is ended. But this story, Juliane's story, is not ended. It is still being written in a research station in the Peruvian Amazon by a woman who fell 3 kilometers from the sky on Christmas Eve and chose, every day since, to keep going. Thank you for watching. Juliane Koepcke's story is one that grows deeper the more you learn about it. The science of the fall, the biology of the jungle, the conservation work at Panguana. If you want a deeper dive into any part of it, let me know in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And tell me, what part of Julianne's story stayed with you the most? I want to know.